This lesson is going to cover the 4 steps to posing your portraits. These steps are incredibly important because this is the gesture stage of your head drawing. And if you're like me and have a tendency to want to get into those beautiful details of the eyes and the nose and have found that you've lost some of that positioning and emotive expression of the head, neck, and shoulders, these 4 steps cover the sizing of your skull, the leaning and tilting of the head's relationship to the context of the neck and shoulder, the position and placement of the jaw, rotation of the head, and then the basic perspective, are you under or over the head? So now we're just going to try it out. We're going to go through some different poses that I've chosen for the arrangement of the head, neck, and shoulder and practice, right? See the different orientation of the different shapes that we set up and just walk you through those steps so that you get comfortable seeing it outside of the clinical environment of me discussing it. So let's start over here. Okay, so first step, basic sphere. Remember, this is not what the human skull looks like. So part of the drawing process is going to be shaving, whittling this down, customizing it. So it only needs to be proportion and shape right now. Now, if I look at her head, right, the one thing I always want to ask myself is, even if my impulse may be to make it completely vertical, it really never is, right? So if it helps you and you're uncomfortable or are new to seeing some of these 2-dimensional leans and how they manifest in the head, neck, and shoulder, sometimes it's helpful to draw over a reference and include that really straight 2-dimensional line so that you have a bit of an ability to gauge. So my guess here is that the head is leaning this way a bit. What is the neck doing? Well, it's certainly not vertical either. So I think it's going this way. And then shoulders do look a bit more horizontal. I'm kind of a diagonal enthusiast. So even if I see something that might be horizontal, I'm usually going to exaggerate it a bit. One thing that you can do, this would be something that I would think more about in just a study of gesture, is starting to catalog and maybe even writing down one word for the emotion that you think you see in an image. That way you start to get a sensitivity to the way that the body might be projecting those nonverbals to an audience, and you become kind of a connoisseur of the way that the body and its arrangement communicates. So that's step 1. This is step 2. Step 3 is the inclusion of the jaw. This is 3/4. So let's just pull our shape line down. So I'm just feeling that line down off the sphere, and then noticing on my model that straight for the chin is closer to the right. There's not too much of a lean back or anything, so that's going to be, I'm going to try to keep that 2/3, 1/3. And then let's bring a line down from the other side of the sphere and bring it right to that corner. Sometimes what we can see in female skulls is that the jaw can be a little bit more narrow. The transition between the remus and mandible, or the width of the jaw, can be a little more slight. If that's stuff you'd like to include here to kind of customize a secondary shape, you can absolutely do that as well. Next, now this isn't something that I put too much in terms of the steps, but I do always like to get a fuller shape for the neck. So here I'm just going to add a C-curve and an S-curve, part of that transition that I talked about earlier. So anytime the head is looking up or straight, I think that the traps are having to hold the head in that position. So that would be represented by this line. That's a C-curve. And then the skin and the stretch of the throat for the front of the neck would be longer and more of a passive curve. The last thing, if you're working with your rib cages, is always going to be off angle. So higher in the back, lower in the front. So again, that's just another diagonal, but in space. And then this would be the way you could lead in terms of this lesson to your figure constructions and anatomy, is then the rib cage would build down there. Next is my center line. So here comes the center. Feeling that over, I'm trying to match that to where I would see it with her. And then one thing that you could keep an eye on in this is, where does that cut the chin? Right, and notice that if you feel like you didn't really get that 3/4 or that turn, maybe your center cut the chin too much in the center, right? In this, it should be foreshortened. So we should have a little less on the side that's turning away, a little more on this side. My cross, so my alignment for the brow might be here. And then where's my ear? So this isn't anything to do with the proportioning yet of the ear. I'm just doing my best to sight it. Looks like it's over here somewhere, but I would definitely say it's slightly lower than the brow. What does that mean? That means we get a really tame or really narrow ellipse, so drawn all the way through that. So that would be my ellipse, that's my last step. And then triple check would be this isn't the center, right? The major axes would be the center. So if I need a double check on that placement from my perspective, that should be halfway on the ball. That's it. Those are your first 4. Okay, let's try another one. So we started with 3/4. This one's moving away. So now we're gonna shift this to be somewhere in between 3/4 and profile. So here's my head, same shape. If you're doing this digitally or traditionally at home, I think the best result or the best way to think about that initial sphere is about the size of your palm if you're practicing. Doing this too small, I think, is a little challenging or difficult. Palm is about a good size. It's not uncomfortable, not too big, not too small. Here's my head, neck, shoulders a little higher on this one. This one looks a little more annoyed to me. So maybe that has to do with the positioning. That'd be something I might want to take note of if I'm getting a feeling or I feel like I can understand or empathize with the emotion of the model or the reference, and I've set up my tilts. That might be an interesting thing to take a note, maybe write a word down to the side. Here's my chin, because I have that 3/4. Maybe I could push it a little bit more. And here's this related back up. That's my jaw, neck. You can see how it starts to become automatic, brow to ear. So let's maybe just make this one step instead of breaking it up. So now I'm seeing this. Maybe we're a little bit more under on this one. So I broadened my ellipse a little bit more. And maybe we want to carry that down to the chin. So as soon as I start to get a lift or enough of a lift on a head or skull, that I would begin to see that perspective reflected down in the bottom, I'll just kind of bring this arcing ellipse down to the chin. And that's it. Here, this one looks suspicious. I would be tempted here to put that is my tilt, but I won't. I think we have this. Hopefully you can see in this sense, though, the utility of exaggerating, right? That maybe pushing it that much or even a little bit extra. And not only does it help you avoid the static quality of something that might be vertical, but you invite your audience in a way that makes the feeling of the drawing a little bit more accessible or clear. And then I see a counter off the neck, and then the shoulder high to low. Now let's feel down the sides for the chin. So here's one where we're getting a lift that I'm tempted to maybe start to bring the proportion of that 2/3, 1/3 out of that comfortable positioning, because it looks like it's going up. And now let's do my neck. So this side feels stretched. This side feels pinched. So let's put a S curve here. When I'm doing these curves, the one thing that might help you remember, the way I'm getting some form or perspective with them is any line that would start to assume something closer to contour. I have 2 rules for that. I always make my lines T overlap or wrap. So they have to end, in other words, behind or around. But if I get in the habit of not doing that, again, this is just another arbitrary rule to help me not make mistakes, is everything becomes too outlined. And when I overly outline something, then it begins to feel flat and then shape driven. Whereas if I just start to move these lines one in front of another or wrap lines like you see me do with the neck above, I'm inviting more of a discussion of form and surface. So that's a T overlap. Here's another T overlap. This doesn't yet have to be the contour of the neck. Could be. But I like to leave myself some room so that I might want to build muscle on that. So maybe it's just inside of that contour. And then here's the elliptical placement of the neck. High in the back, low in the front. And then brow. So big difference on this one. I could even kind of use my initial tilt for that center line because it's really close. When I look at the cross, that would be up here. Right? So that's that. And then relative to that brow, I see the ear pretty low down. So that's around here. So those would become my marks for how I'm going to set this ellipse up. So there's my ellipse. This, I'm just going to bring a little bit more line weight to the front. Right? This is still very notational, so it doesn't matter that it's perfect. But now we could do that, maybe push this a little bit more too. So this arcing perspective, we bring that down to the jaw. Later on, just so you don't worry that you're going to have giant basketball head people, we're going to start to shave this down. We're going to start looking at the component parts of the skull and saying, hey, this is actually a flat concave surface. So that means we got to cut this and get rid of it. So later we're going to be sculpting into these. And so I know there can be some anxiety around your drawings early on where you're like, oh, that doesn't look like a person yet. So there's a little bit of delayed gratification, which I like because it makes and leaves room for error along the way. I just, again, piece at a time. Let's try another one here. Let's start going a little faster. Head, tilt, 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 jaw, rotated, 3/4, neck, force pinch on this side, insertion to the rib cage, brow for my T. Centerline for me always rolls off the form of the ball. As soon as it hits the brow, I plummet so that it just goes parallel to the front of the face or the tilt. And that's one area that I would just caution you. What I see students do quite a bit there as a part of the learning curve, or just sometimes an error, is if that becomes too curved, like sometimes it'll go like people do this, then it warps your face. That's not, I mean, it could be fine if that's maybe you have an idea for a character that would look something like this. But if we're trying to build a human face, this would basically take your whole lower part and start to kind of curve it back or put it on a backward curve. And that could make the perspective feel a little distorted. So nothing wrong with it, but if you're getting kind of in the hang of these 4 steps, just something to be aware of. So brow, ears back here, looks a little lower. So here's my perspective. Is that in the center? Let's double check. Pretty close, good enough. So that means I haven't lost that turn or rotation of the sphere, lifting it up or down. And so these so far are primarily slightly under, right? 3/4. Let's choose one that would be the opposite. So let's do this one. All right, what would we do when something is more above? So here's same start. Tilt, neck, shoulder. This is pretty symmetrical. So let's bring this down. I'm always happy when my tilt line doubles as my symmetry line. Feels like I've really accomplished something.
Yeah!
This feels like it could be center line. Brow would be here. Neck, shorter. Right, so that's something I'd want to start to try to show or indicate. Just gives a little bit of that overlapping, the neck hiding, pinching on this side. Ear is higher. So I could just note, you don't have to draw the little shapes for the ear, you could just kind of mentally make a check or note where that would be, and then aim your ellipse to run through there. Let's try this one down here. Head, tilt, a cool angle for the neck, kind of pushing the head forward, crazy tilt angle for that shoulder. Here's my jaw, 3/4. This would be a nice pinch for that neck. It's kind of fun. Here would be the stretch of the neck in front, and then that's the connection into that rib cage here. Brow, going to do our... So one thing here you got to be careful with is the placement of the bone versus the placement of the muscle. So if you're like me, you might have been tempted to see the brow like that. So this is good for me to clean up my terminology. That's not the brow that I mean. So not the eyebrow. Eyebrow is useful, but I'm talking more about the brow ridge. So the ridge of your brow is the prominence of bone, right? So once we have the forehead, right before the socket, there's that little shelf of bone that would then drop back and into the socket. And then you'd have your glabella and nasal saddle and all the structure of the nose. So this would be a better point of observation. Just keep that in mind because the skin and the brow move. So here would be the ellipse maybe for this one. Okay, let's try this one. This one's nearing profile, but here's a couple things we could consider. So let's say first complication that we might have here is the addition of expression. Right, so I would try to separate that for now, if possible. So here's my head, tilt, neck, and then cool line for the shoulder turning this way. The jaw, I could see is open and dropped. That would be something I would try to address a little bit later. So I would leave it maybe about there. I do drop the jaw when the mouth is open, of course, but this is still kind of my template or placeholder for the big 4, right? Size, tilt, rotation, and perspective. So if you see something that doesn't at this stage add or contribute to the setup of those, you have permission to not worry about it until later. So here would be the neck. That's my pinching. And then the stretch here. This one where we have that back view, sometimes what I like to do in these is just give and bring that hard surface of the rib cage around it in front. That way we get this overlap. That gives me a nice overlap there. Same thing, so you gotta be very careful with your assessment of where that brow would be. So I'm gonna bring my center. I see the brow, so they're pretty high, maybe around there. Then relate this line to the ear. They could drop that a little bit more. There's my ellipse. Is that centered to the sphere? Pretty close. And so now I'd be set up. When we start to get into, so next would be thinking about proportion. I really want to know this, or at least this much, before I start to make changes to the sizing of the jaw. But this is where I would find in my proportion the separation of the teeth. So opening the mouth would really just involve kind of taking this form and then starting to move it back in space this way. That would be something for later, but that would be set up with this stage. I don't want you to get overly invested. I know it's so easy to have that happen in the face where we could start to pick out and find all the small features, the details, and that it can shake us out of however solid or streamlined the process is. So don't feel too worried about that for now. Let's say we wanted to do one to take this and then just move it a little bit more into profile position. This isn't a bad exercise as well. Sometimes it's nice to just see if you have, or see where your command of the basic steps and the workflow is by going off script a bit, maybe looking at something that you have and then starting to push it or nudge it into something that you'd like. If I wanted to make that profile, I could keep the same lean because I like that. I really like how crowded her neck and shoulder is. And it gives off this really wild expression. Those are things I might want to keep for my character. And we had fun kind of with that neck. But I don't like the 3/4, or maybe she needs to not look at camera or instead toward something in the distance or a character that's off screen. Well, I have a basic idea how to do that. I could just bring this straight down. That matches, or that should always match my tilt. And then we're not going to have that straight for the chin. So instead, I'll just be keeping that more of a triangle. So in profiles, I always see a lot of triangles. As far as how I design and think figures, I see a lot of triangles in profiles and then in areas of intersections. So like the neck and shoulders are all triangles to me. So here's that. Let's say, well, I want to see, this one was under, but maybe I want to push it a little bit more. So maybe I'd say the brow is higher and then the ear. So maybe we have more of a lean. So I'm going to open that ellipse. So to compare the two, based on the ellipse that we made in this one, it's pretty moderate. So you don't have to draw these cylinders, but this helps illustrate what I'm thinking. That ellipse equals that view. Whereas here, if I open the ellipse to that degree and I try to represent that as a cylinder, now I'm showing you that angle. At least that's what my mind is thinking. I think the same effect will be followed through when we go through the remaining steps in this approach. So here's the chin. We can start to do that same thing down here that we've been doing to the other views from beneath, where I just recreate this feel of the ellipse on the bottom. So maybe this is that canopy of the jaw that we've been talking a bit about. This is that stretch. Brow, just to give you some context since we don't have a picture for this one, would be there, ears back here. And then now I've just shifted, the view of this head to look that way by doing nothing other than making an adjustment at step 3. And then, of course, kind of making more dramatic the angle of perspective there. Maybe that doesn't suit this view. You can always just open it a little bit down here too. But this stage for me would always stay really loose and sketchy and kind of even exploratory so that we foreground the idea for the head and not its render. This looks like a good challenging one. Head, tilt, neck, and shoulder, jaw. I think I'm going to subtract the jaw for this one. Chin is going to be in here. So with this one, what I want to focus on is in a view like this, how do you start to incorporate that underplane to kind of gel with your neck a little bit more? So here's my front, brow to ear, really high, big difference, kind of like the profile we just made. So this is my center, So that's going to be pretty big. Again, for me, that is adding or visualizing a connection between the eyebrow and then where that top of the ear might be. So that kind of swinging down to grab that. Maybe I could push this up even more. And then what happens is we get this bottom plane. So you're just kind of rethinking that ellipse and its placement through the creation of that plane underneath the cylinder. And then again, this is the canopy of the jaw. So I'm framing this. You could just make it a box. You could make it a box. You could make it this ellipse, something to show that there's a plane change. Right, so if we look at this from profile, what that would represent would be, so here's my skull, spine. So you have a few muscles that will come back to what's called the hyoid bone here. And that's what creates the profile. So there's some muscles, and then there's a gland that softens some of the jawline. And then that becomes the top of the thyroid cartilage and then muscle that goes down to your neck. So I'm just looking for what this plane is doing. But imagine if we didn't have that, right? If you just had like, if I didn't indicate for that, then we'd all kind of be like Jabba the Hutt, or your head would become your body or something weird. So this gives me my front, bottom, and then now I'd be trying to think about how that might relate to the cylinder of the neck. So this one, there's a big pinch in the back. So there's my C curve. This is a wrapping line. So that's why that ellipse will become so important later for the head. It gives you a preliminary understanding of the entirety of the surface. Right? So if I want to add or build connections with other forms, I know I have to come back in and kind of grab or relate my forms to that. So that you see that all the fun muscle coming behind that. And then in the front, we have the stretch. So this is where I start to stretch my neck. But what I'm trying to show you here in 3D is the same as what I just drew in this 2D diagram, that the plane of that underside of the jaw meets up with and then becomes the front of the neck. This one's clearly angry. Head, tilt, neck, turn of shoulder. So even for the shoulder, what could be interesting is noticing the width. This might be kind of more nuanced and subtle, but something where the shoulder is turned away as opposed to, like, look at the one above, front facing. Like sometimes emotion can just do or have to do with kind of the disclosure or the presence or the absence of the body in that nonverbal sense, right? Where kind of hiding versus presenting the body can have two very different feels. Like this is forward facing. Right? So we might denote that as having more honesty, more calm or comfortability. And then something like this where the body is hidden or shrouded, right? Or think about sadness where the shoulders drop or slump. So here would be my tilts. And if you wanted to play around with dropping the jaw to try to set up for that shift of the mandible off the skull, you should feel more than free to do that. Never really works too well for me. I like to go with my standard and then find the deviations later. So that's my head shape. And I think it's just slight 3/4. So it's just going slightly off that symmetrical chin placement. Brow, here's my cross. So I'm thinking it's about there. Ear is slightly below. So I give another mild ellipse. And then here's my pinch. And then stretch. And here's the bottom of that neck.